The freezing autumn drizzle of October 1887 did not fall upon the High Sierra mining camp of Iron Ridge. It seeped into it, a relentless, bone-chilling mist that tasted thickly of sulfur, crushed coal dust, and rotting pine boards. The camp was a miserable, deeply isolated scar carved directly into the steep granite throat of the alpine timberline. It was a place where men traded their lungs and their lives for veins of silver, owned entirely, body and soul, by the merciless ledger of the mining company. Nora stood outside the rough-hewn timber walls of the camp wash house, her raw, red hands trembling violently as they gripped the edge of a heavy wooden laundry vat. The caustic, burning scent of harsh lye soap clung to her blistered skin, but the physical pain in her hands was completely eclipsed by the deep, agonizing, pulling ache in her lower spine. She was 25 years old, and she was 6 months pregnant. The heavy, swollen weight of her unborn child shifted restlessly within her, a beautiful, innocent life blooming in the center of an absolute nightmare. 3 weeks ago, the rotting support timbers in shaft number 4 had catastrophically failed. Nora's husband, Elias, had been buried beneath 70 tons of crushed slate and silver ore. She had not even been given a body to bury. The company had simply blasted the shaft closed and declared it a tomb. But in Iron Ridge, a dead man's debts did not die with him. The heavy, sucking sound of leather boots marching through the thick, freezing black mud pulled Nora from her exhausted, grief-stricken days. Foreman Griggs strode toward the wash house, flanked by 2 heavily armed company guards carrying rusted Winchester repeating rifles. Griggs was a cruel, sadistic man who viewed human beings strictly as livestock, his breath smelling foully of stale whiskey and cheap, sweet pomade. He carried something heavy and metallic over his shoulder, the rusted iron clinking ominously with every step. "You missed your shift at the sorting tables this morning, widow," Griggs spat, stopping just inches from her, his dark, greedy eyes dropping to the pronounced, heavy swell of her pregnant belly. "I was sick," Nora whispered, her voice trembling, her hands instinctively moving to cover her stomach in a fierce, protective, maternal shield. "The baby. The pains were too sharp. I came to the wash house to earn my keep instead. I am trying, Mr. Griggs." "Trying doesn't balance the company ledger," Griggs sneered, wiping the freezing drizzle from his mustache. "Elias died owing the company store over $400 for tools and rations. That debt transfers entirely to his surviving property. You belong to the company now. Every ounce of labor you produce belongs to us. And that pup you're carrying? The second it's old enough to hold a tin cup, it belongs to the company, too." Nora's dark eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. "No," she gasped, the breath leaving her lungs in a white plume of freezing vapor. "You cannot claim my child. That is slavery. We are not slaves. You are whatever the ledger says you are," Griggs barked, his face twisting into a mask of cruel, unyielding authority. He lunged forward, his rough, dirty hands violently grabbing Nora by her thin, faded wool shoulder. He shoved her backward against the rough, splintering pine wall of the wash house. Nora cried out, a sharp gasp of pain escaping her lips as her heavy, aching back struck the wood. Griggs dropped to one knee in the freezing black mud. He swung the heavy, rusted object he had been carrying off his shoulder. It was a massive, incredibly thick iron logging chain, the kind used to haul multi-ton redwood trunks down the mountain passes. He wrapped the heavy, freezing, rusted iron links directly around Nora's left ankle. The cold bite of the massive iron against her skin was paralyzing. Griggs threaded a heavy steel padlock through the links and snapped it completely shut with a sharp, sickening, metallic clack. He took the other end of the massive chain and secured it directly to a heavy iron mooring ring bolted deeply into the foundation of the wash house. "To make sure you don't get any desperate ideas about walking down the mountain," Griggs mocked loudly, turning to address the gathering crowd of exhausted, soot-stained miners who had stopped to watch. "The widow stays chained to the wash house until she pays off her dead husband's grave. She's company property." The miners looked away, casting their eyes down into the mud, terrified of the armed guards. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Nora was left standing in the freezing, relentless alpine drizzle, completely humiliated, tethered to a wooden wall like a feral dog. The crushing weight of the heavy logging chain dug agonizingly into her ankle. She dropped to her knees in the cold mud, her raw hands desperately gripping the rusted iron, pulling and tearing at the massive links. The iron did not yield. The absolute, suffocating reality of her hopelessness crashed down upon her, and she wept, her tears mixing with the freezing rain, her arms wrapping fiercely around her unborn child as she sobbed into the cold mud. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The cruelty of the mining camp was suddenly, viscerally interrupted by a sound that did not belong to the clatter of the wash house or the grinding of the ore carts. It was the heavy, rhythmic, earth-shaking crunch of incredibly massive boots stepping deliberately onto the muddy main thoroughfare of the camp. The ambient chatter of the guards instantly ceased. The freezing wind coming down from the high alpine peaks seemed to follow the man walking out of the dense, fog-choked tree line. Silas Thorne had come down from the high timberline. Known in terrified whispers as the Iron, Silas was a colossal, heavily scarred mountain recluse who lived in absolute, self-imposed isolation near the roaring, freezing white water of the upper alpine waterfalls. He was a former railroad blacksmith, a giant of a man whose shoulders were impossibly broad beneath a heavy, oil-treated canvas duster. His arms, exposed where his sleeves were rolled up, were as thick as young tree trunks, heavily corded with dense, incredibly dense muscle forged by years of swinging a 20-pound sledgehammer against glowing steel. His skin was permanently stained with dark soot, his heavy beard wild, and his dark eyes burned with the haunted, terrifying intensity of a man who believed his massive hands were completely cursed to destroy everything they touched. Silas carried a massive bundle of thick winter pelts over his shoulder, walking toward the trading post. The camp guards instinctively stepped back, their hands nervously hovering over their holstered revolvers. The giant smelled of high-altitude ozone, sharp pine resin, and cold, unyielding granite. As he crossed the center of the camp, Silas stopped. His dark, heavy gaze locked onto the wash house. He saw the freezing, sobbing pregnant woman kneeling in the black mud. He saw the heavy, rusted logging chain cutting into her ankle. He saw Foreman Griggs standing on the porch, a cruel, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Silas did not negotiate. He did not draw a weapon. He let the massive bundle of expensive winter pelts slip from his broad shoulder, dropping them carelessly into the mud. He turned and walked directly toward Nora. "Hey! Back off, mountain man!" Griggs shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming terror as the colossal giant approached. Griggs frantically drew his heavy Colt revolver, leveling the barrel directly at Silas's broad chest. "That is company property. Step away or I swear to God I'll drop you where you stand." Silas completely ignored the drawn gun. He ignored the two guards raising their rifles. He did not even blink. The giant dropped to one massive knee in the freezing black mud directly beside Nora. He looked down at her tear-streaked face, his dark eyes entirely devoid of pity, completely filled instead with a fierce, burning, tectonic fury at the men who had dared to treat a mother like a beast of burden. Silas reached down with his massive, heavily scarred hands. He did not fumble with the heavy steel padlock. He possessed the master, intimate knowledge of a master blacksmith. He knew exactly how iron was forged, how it cooled, and exactly where the microscopic stress fractures lived inside the metal. He wrapped his colossal, soot-stained hands around the thickest, most rusted link of the heavy logging chain. Silas closed his eyes, his jaw locking tight. The thick, corded muscles in his massive forearms and broad shoulders instantly bulged, completely stretching the heavy canvas of his duster to its absolute tearing point. He didn't just pull. He twisted, applying sheer, terrifying, unadulterated, raw kinetic brute force directly against the weak point of the forged metal. The heavy iron link groaned, a high-pitched, metallic squeal of absolute stress. Crack. The sound was as deafening as a rifle shot echoing off the granite cliffs. The massive, thick iron logging chain violently snapped entirely in half in his bare hands. The entire mining camp gasped in sheer, breathless, paralyzed shock. Foreman Griggs's hand began to shake violently, the revolver lowering completely on its own accord as his mind failed to comprehend the impossible, monstrous physical strength he had just witnessed. Silas stood up to his full, towering height. He casually tossed the broken, heavy piece of iron directly at Griggs's leather boots. The metal hit the mud with a heavy, final thud. Without uttering a single syllable, Silas turned back to Nora. The terrifying, feral giant reached down with an impossible, breathtaking gentleness. He slipped his massive arms completely beneath her, lifting the exhausted, pregnant widow effortlessly from the freezing mud, cradling her and her unborn child securely against his broad, warm chest. She weighed absolutely nothing to him. He turned his broad back on the trembling foreman, completely ignoring the drawn guns of the entire camp, and began to march with heavy, purposeful, earth-shaking strides directly out of the miserable settlement, carrying her up the steep, foggy trail toward the roaring, unyielding sanctuary of the high alpine mountains. The ascent was a punishing, vertical battle against the very spine of the world, but Silas Thorne did not falter. He carried her through the freezing autumn drizzle as if she weighed absolutely nothing, his massive, heavy boots finding perfect, silent purchase on the slick granite shelves and the treacherous, moss-covered roots of ancient pine trees. The air grew noticeably thinner, biting at the lungs with the sharp, metallic taste of high-altitude ozone and crushed pine resin. With every step they took away from the miserable, sulfur-choked mining camp of Iron Ridge, the deafening roar of the upper alpine waterfall grew louder, until the sheer, kinetic vibration of the plunging white water physically resonated within Nora's bones. She lay against his broad, incredibly warm chest, her exhausted eyes fluttering shut. The heavy canvas of his duster smelled fiercely of wood smoke, old leather, and the stark, clean scent of the high peaks. For the first time since Elias had been crushed in the dark earth, Nora felt entirely, undeniably safe. The rusted, broken iron cuff still clung to her left ankle, a heavy, brutal reminder of what she had just escaped, but the man carrying her possessed hands that could shatter such cruelty as easily as dry kindling. They broke through the dense, fog-choked timberline just as the gray afternoon began to bleed into a bruised, freezing twilight. Silas's sanctuary was not a simple, fragile timber shack. It was a massive, heavily fortified fortress built directly into the sheltering, concave face of the granite cliff. The walls were constructed of immense, perfectly cut stone blocks, sealed tightly against the brutal alpine winds. Attached to the side of the main living quarters was a sprawling, open-air blacksmith's forge, entirely sheltered by a heavy, overhanging cedar shake roof. The massive, soot-stained anvil sat in the center of the workspace like a dark altar, surrounded by racks of heavy hammers, long iron tongs, and a colossal leather bellows. Silas pushed open the heavy, iron-banded oak door of the cabin with his shoulder. The interior was a vast, cold, dimly lit vault that smelled deeply of cold ash, granite dust, and isolation. He moved to a heavy, furs-piled timber bed in the corner of the room and bent his massive knees, lowering Nora onto the thick bear pelts with a gentleness that was entirely contradictory to his terrifying size. He immediately stepped backward, creating a sudden, chilling physical distance between them. Nora shivered, her faded wool dress soaked through from the camp's freezing rain. Silas did not speak. He moved with swift, silent efficiency to the massive stone hearth taking up the far wall. Within moments, he had coaxed a roaring, brilliant fire to life from a bed of dry cedar kindling and split oak logs. He fetched a heavy iron kettle, filled it with fresh water from a wooden bucket, and hung it over the flames. He placed a tin plate of hardtack, dried mountain venison, and a clean woolen blanket on the edge of the bed. Then, the colossal, soot-stained giant turned his broad back on her. He did not look at her swollen belly. He did not look at her exhausted, tear-stained face. He simply walked out the heavy oak door, shutting it firmly behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing warmth of the stone cabin. Nora pulled the dry woolen blanket over her trembling shoulders, the heat of the fire slowly driving the freezing damp from her bones. She ate the dried meat ravenously, the nourishment sending a sudden, sharp flutter of movement through her pregnant belly. the baby kicking in response to the warmth and the food. But as the hours stretched into the pitch-black alpine night, the profound, heavy silence of the cabin began to press down upon her chest. She could hear the wind howling outside, driving sleet against the thick glass of the single window, but she could also hear the heavy, rhythmic pacing of boots on stone. Silas had not gone to sleep. He was out in the attached, open-air forge, entirely exposed to the biting, freezing draft of the mountain. To a woman who had just been treated as cursed, indebted property, his extreme physical distance did not read as respectful chivalry. It read as absolute, undeniable fear and revulsion. He is terrified of me, she thought, the hot, bitter tears pricking her eyes once more. He looked at my belly and realized exactly what he carried up this mountain. A broken, exhausted widow and another man's child. He broke the chains out of pity, but he cannot bear to share the same air as the burden he has taken on. She lay down on the heavy bear pelts, her spine aching fiercely, and wept silently into the dark until physical exhaustion finally dragged her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. When the pale, watery gray light of dawn filtered through the cabin window, Nora awoke to an empty room. The fire in the hearth had been meticulously banked, glowing with a deep, sustainable heat, but Silas was gone. Nora pushed herself up from the bed, her lower back screaming in protest. The heavy, broken iron cuff still rattled against her ankle when she walked. She moved to the window and looked out. The giant was nowhere to be seen, likely hunting the high ridges for their survival. A fierce, desperate, white-hot spark of absolute maternal defiance suddenly ignited deep within Nora's chest. The mining company had chained her like a dog, and the giant might regret bringing her to his fortress, but she was absolutely not a useless, fragile piece of glass. She was a mother. She was a builder of life. She would not sit idle in a warm bed and wait to be discarded as a helpless, weeping burden. She wrapped the heavy woolen blanket around her shoulders and pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the freezing, misty alpine morning. She walked directly into the attached blacksmith's forge. The workspace was chaotic, covered in years of accumulated, undisturbed neglect. A thick layer of black soot and iron oxide dust coated every single surface. Massive, heavy iron tongs were scattered haphazardly across the stone floor. The colossal, heavy leather bellows, the mechanical lungs of the forge, were stiff, dry, and cracking from the harsh mountain air. Silas had clearly spent years punishing himself with grueling labor here, but he had entirely abandoned the care and order of his craft. This was her battlefield. Nora did not hesitate. She found a heavy, bound broom of dry pine boughs leaning against the stone wall. Ignoring the throbbing ache in her back and the heavy weight of her unborn child, she began to sweep. She forcefully pushed the years of accumulated black soot and metallic dust out of the forge and over the edge of the granite cliff, watching it vanish into the roaring mist of the waterfall. She moved to the heavy wooden workbenches. Her hands, still raw and blistered from the lye soap of the camp wash house, gripped the massive, heavy iron tongs and the long-handled sledgehammers. She lifted them with agonizing effort, organizing them meticulously by size and function, hanging them neatly on the heavy iron pegs driven into the stone wall. She found a sealed clay jar of rendered bear fat sitting near the cooling slack tub. Nora knelt before the massive, stiff leather bellows. She scooped the thick grease into her bare hands and began to vigorously, violently rub the fat directly into the cracking, dry leather. She worked the grease deeply into the pores of the hide, using the friction of her own raw hands to heat the fat, massaging life and suppleness back into the mechanical lungs of the giant's forge. For 4 brutal, unbroken hours, Nora waged a relentless, silent war against the chaotic decay. Her back cramped, her knuckles ached, and sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the dark soot she wiped from her brow. But she did not stop. She poured every ounce of her humiliation, every cruel word from Foreman Griggs, and the agonizing memory of her husband's death directly into her raw, capable hands. "I am not a chained animal," she chanted internally, her breath coming in heavy, rhythmic gasps as she hoisted another massive hammer onto the wall. "I bring order. I build life. I am not dead space." Just past noon, The heavy crunch of boots on the granite trail echoed over the roar of the waterfall. Silas Thorne emerged from the dense pine trees. He carried a heavy brace of wild mountain hares over his broad shoulder, his canvas duster damp from the mountain mist. As he stepped under the overhanging cedar roof of the forge, he froze completely. His massive boots stopped dead on the stone. His pale, haunted eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. The dark, chaotic, soot-choked tomb of his forge had been completely eradicated. The workspace smelled fiercely of clean pine, melted fat, and wet stone. The heavy tools were gleaming, impeccably organized on the walls. The massive leather bellows shone with a deep, rich, indestructible luster, fully restored to life. And standing in the very center of the forge, leaning heavily against the massive iron anvil, was Nora. She was covered in black soot and grease. Her chest was heaving with deep, ragged gasps of pure physical exhaustion. Her hands were raw and trembling from the massive physical exertion. She did not look away, and she did not attempt to hide her heavily pregnant belly or the broken iron chain dangling from her ankle. She pulled herself upright with agonizing effort, her dark eyes locking onto his with a fierce, burning, unbreakable defiance. She was waiting for him to tell her she was a burden. She was waiting for him to cast her out. Silas stared at the flawlessly restored bellows, and then his dark, haunted eyes dropped to her greasy, blistered, trembling hands. He had banished himself to the high peaks because he truly believed his massive, violent hands were cursed to only cause destruction and death. But as he looked at the sheer, monumental grit and breathtaking capability radiating from the pregnant widow he had pulled from the mud, the colossal mountain man realized with a sudden, violent, earth-shattering clarity that he had not brought a fragile, broken liability into his sanctuary. He had brought home absolute, indestructible light. The sudden, agonizing pain in his left arm, combined with the crushing realization that he had brought violence into the very room where a pregnant widow was sleeping, shattered the fragile peace Silas Thorne had found. He had spent years punishing himself on this isolated peak, hammering cold iron until his hands bled, trying to atone for a fire he couldn't stop. And now, he had almost caused another tragedy. He needed to remove her from his cursed presence immediately, before his blood-soaked hands destroyed her too. He walked to the back of the forge, his massive, bleeding form moving with a heavy, grim determination. He reached beneath a loose flagstone near the cooling tub and pulled out a heavy, leather-wrapped package. He carried it back into the main cabin and dropped it heavily onto the timber table. "The sleet has stopped," Silas said, his voice entirely hollow, stripped of the tectonic warmth that had comforted her earlier. He did not look at her or the baby. He stared rigidly at the leather package. "I will escort you down the back trail tomorrow morning. It leads directly to the main stagecoach road, avoiding the mining camp entirely. You will take this." Nora stood by the hearth, her breathing still ragged from the chaotic fight, her hands trembling as she held the bloody fire poker. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling, though not from fear. "Raw silver. Unrefined, but pure," Silas rumbled, the words tearing out of his throat like rusted nails. "It's enough to buy a first-class ticket to San Francisco. Enough to secure a clean room in a civilized hospital. You will have your child in safety, surrounded by doctors, far away from the filth and the violence." He finally forced himself to look up, his dark, haunted eyes completely shattered, filled with a self-loathing so immense it threatened to swallow the cabin entirely. "Look at the blood on my hands, Nora! Look at the violence I brought to your feet. I am a scarred, feral beast who lives in the dirt and speaks through butchery. My hands only destroy. I cannot protect you from the brutality of the world when my entire existence is built upon it. Go to the city. Find a gentle man who wears silk and drinks tea. Your child deserves to be born in the light." He turned his broad back to her, his massive shoulders trembling violently as he fought a losing battle against the agonizing, suffocating grief of his own sacrifice. He truly believed he was entirely unfit to breathe the same air as the magnificent, life-giving woman who had restored his forge and tended his wounds. Nora stared at the heavy leather package of silver. It was the ultimate key to absolute societal power. It was the financial means to erase her past, to completely escape the harsh, freezing reality of the high mountains, and to finally be deemed acceptable by a civilized world that had treated her like property. Nora walked slowly toward the heavy timber table. Silas squeezed his eyes tightly shut, listening to her scuffed boots moving across the stone. He waited for the rustle of the package being opened, bracing his scarred soul for the excruciating, final sound of her accepting the wealth, preparing to leave him to rot in the silent ice forever. Nora did not open the package. She reached out with her blistered, bruised hands, grabbed the heavy leather bundle, and violently hurled it across the room. The package struck the stone wall with a heavy, resonating thud, the raw silver chunks spilling uselessly across the cold floorboards, entirely ignored and permanently rejected. Silas spun around at the sound of the crash. His jaw dropped, his dark eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. What have you done? That was your entire future. That was safety for your child. Nora turned to face him, the warm firelight illuminating her resilient silhouette and the pronounced, beautiful swell of her pregnancy. She did not look like a frightened, discarded widow. She looked like the absolute, unquestionable sovereign of the high peaks. Safety? Nora demanded, her voice ringing out with a fierce, crystalline authority that commanded the very mountain to bow. She closed the distance between them with steady, majestic strides. Safe in a civilized world? The same world that shackled my ankle to a wash-house wall and claimed my unborn child as property. The world that measures my human soul by its utility to their ledger. She marched right up to his towering frame, refusing to let him look away, her dark eyes blazing with an overwhelming, consuming inferno of absolute devotion. I was told my entire life that I was nothing more than a vessel, Nora stated, her voice trembling with raw, tectonic emotion. She reached out, her raw, blistered hands gripping the heavy canvas lapels of his duster, pulling the giant forcefully downward until his face was inches from hers. But you looked at my chains and you snapped them with your bare hands. You brought me to the high peaks and you gave me sanctuary when the world threw me away. She pressed her palms gently against his heavily bearded, soot-stained cheeks, her thumbs tracing the deep lines of his face. My child does not need a cowardly doctor in a sterile city, Nora whispered fiercely, hot tears streaming down her face. My child needs a father with hands strong enough to shatter chains and a heart brave enough to defend us. My roots are permanently planted in this stone. I am not going to San Francisco. I am never, ever leaving this mountain. You are our home. The impenetrable, stoic iron walls of the mountain man instantly, completely disintegrated into dust. A raw, guttural, jagged sob tore itself from the very depths of his massive chest. He collapsed to his knees on the hard stone floor, completely ignoring the pain in his bleeding arm. His enormous arms wrapped desperately around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his weeping, scarred face directly into the soft, warm swell of her pregnant belly, clinging to her resilient frame as if she were the only absolute truth in a dissolving universe. My light, Silas wept, the hot tears soaking into the fabric of her dress, his broad shoulders shaking with the profound, agonizing relief of a man finally, truly brought out of the dark. My absolute, perfect life. My wife. I am right here, Nora whispered, her calloused fingers weaving gently through his thick, dark hair, cradling his heavy head against her body with fierce, unyielding tenderness. The storm is over, my love. We will build the fire again. He held her there in the freezing, shattered ruins of the cabin, the profound, heavy silence of the alpine peaks settling warmly over them. The staggering fortune of silver lay forgotten on the floor, but as the scarred mountain man knelt before the magnificent, deeply nurturing woman who had chosen his brutal reality over a gilded cage, he knew he possessed a wealth that could never be mined, measured, or stolen. 5 years later, the dark, claustrophobic stone cabin near the roaring waterfall was a breathtaking, impossible oasis of life on the edge of the high timberline. The fortress had been magnificently expanded outward into a sprawling, sun-drenched, heavy timber frame homestead. A massive, perfectly functioning stone hearth radiated a constant, deep warmth through the wide rooms. The metallic smell of gunpowder and isolation had been permanently eradicated, replaced by the warm, sweet, intoxicating aroma of roasting venison, blooming alpine wildflowers, and the rich, complex depth of a masterfully managed forge. Nora was no longer the chained outcast of the territory. She was its most revered, legendary matriarch, sought out by passing riders and isolated trappers alike for her wisdom and the unbreakable tools forged by her husband. Sitting in a heavy rocking chair carved from solid pine on the expansive porch was Nora. She wore a beautifully tailored, vibrant blue dress of soft, breathable wool. She was entirely radiant, her dark eyes sparkling with profound, overflowing joy. The fragile, exhausted, humiliated widow weeping in the mud was a distant, unrecognizable memory. She moved with total, unshakable confidence, owning her power and her sanctuary with the absolute, undeniable grace of a queen. She looked out toward the open-air forge, the rhythmic, heavy clang-clang-clang of a hammer striking an anvil echoing beautifully over the roar of the waterfall. Standing in the brilliant, golden afternoon sunlight was Silas. He wore a clean flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his incredibly thick, heavily muscled forearms. The cold, dead, feral terror in his dark eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. Standing beside him on a sturdy wooden stool, gripping a small, perfectly weighted hammer with both hands, was a robust, dark-haired 4-year-old boy. The child was striking a small piece of heated iron on the massive anvil, giggling with wild, untamed joy as his father guided his movements. Silas's massive, calloused hand rested protectively over the boy's small hands, ensuring every strike was safe and true. The giant who once believed his hands only destroyed was now patiently, lovingly teaching the next generation how to build. Silas paused, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist, and looked back toward the porch. He smiled, a deep, rich expression that completely transformed his heavily scarred face. He didn't just look at his wife, he worshipped her. He raised his massive hand in a silent, devoted greeting. His dark eyes met hers, filled with an adoration that was legendary across the entire High Sierra range. The cruel, greedy society festering in the mining camps far below could keep their rigid ledgers and their heavy chains. Here, insulated against the howling alpine winds, the scarred Leviathan and the resilient mother had proven with absolute, undeniable certainty that the strongest iron is not forged in the fires of industry, but in the unyielding heat of a chosen, fiercely protected love. The freak, early autumn sleet storm that had relentlessly battered the high alpine peaks finally broke just before mid-morning, leaving the rugged, vertical granite world entirely encased in a treacherous, shimmering armor of thick black ice. The sky above the timberline was a blinding, piercing shade of bruised blue, and the deafening, kinetic roar of the freezing whitewater waterfall echoed violently through the narrow mountain pass. Down on the steep, winding trail leading up to the stone cabin, the heavy, metallic clack-clack of lever-action rifles being chambered cut through the freezing mist. Foreman Griggs had not let the absolute, public humiliation of the broken iron chain go unanswered. Driven by a toxic, manic greed and a desperate need to reassert his sadistic dominance over the terrified miners of Iron Ridge, Griggs had emptied the company's safe to hire 3 hardened Pinkerton mercenaries. These were not the starving, exhausted miners he usually bullied. They were heavily armed, ruthless rail war enforcers wrapped in thick wool coats, carrying heavy, double-barreled scatterguns and repeating rifles. They cursed the thinning, freezing air and the slick, icy granite beneath their boots, but the promise of a massive bounty for the head of the mountain giant kept them climbing. Griggs marched behind them, his face pale with cold and rage, determined to drag his pregnant property back down the mountain and make a bloody, unforgettable example of the feral beast who had dared to touch his ledger. Inside the massive stone cabin, the air was a sanctuary of profound, insulated warmth. A roaring fire blazed in the colossal stone hearth, filling the room with the rich, heavy scent of burning cedar and roasted pine nuts. Nora sat in a heavy wooden chair near the flames, her raw, blistered hands resting gently atop the pronounced, beautiful swell of her pregnant belly. She watched Silas, who was kneeling near the edge of the hearth, meticulously wrapping a thick linen bandage around a deep, ugly bruise on his calf, an injury sustained the night before when he had thrown himself between her and a falling, ice-laden tree branch. The peace of the high peaks was sudden, violently, and irrevocably shattered. The heavy, iron-banded oak door of the stone cabin did not just open. It was violently, explosively kicked inward by a heavy leather boot. The thick iron hinges groaned and tore free from the stone masonry, the massive wooden door crashing heavily onto the interior floorboards. A blinding wave of freezing, sub-zero alpine air rushed into the warm sanctuary, swirling the grey ash from the hearth into the air like a sudden snowstorm. The three Pinkerton mercenaries stepped through the shattered threshold, their boots tracking slick, black ice and mud onto the floor. They instantly leveled the dark, rusted barrels of their shotguns and rifles, their eyes scanning the dim interior. Griggs stepped in behind them, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his freezing face. "Thought you could steal company property and hide in the clouds, you feral beast?" Griggs sneered, his grating voice echoing off the stone walls. His dark eyes instantly locked onto Nora, dropping to her swollen stomach. "Get on your feet, widow. You belong to the Ledger, and you are walking back down that mountain today, even if I have to drag you by your hair through the sleet." Nora's breath hitched, a sudden, blinding spike of ingrained terror flooding her veins at the sight of the cruel foreman, but she did not scream. Silas Thorne did not attempt to negotiate. He did not raise his hands in surrender, and he did not reach for the hunting rifle resting on the far wall. The giant mountain man slowly stood up to his full, towering, terrifying height, his pale, scarred face entirely devoid of fear. His dark, haunted eyes dilated, transitioning instantly from a quiet, gentle protector into the absolute, cold-blooded apex predator of the High Sierras. He reached out his massive, soot-stained right hand. Resting against the stone masonry of the hearth was his primary blacksmithing tool, a colossal, 20-pound, solid steel sledgehammer, affixed to a 4-foot, thick hickory handle. Silas gripped the heavy hickory wood. "Take him down!" Griggs shrieked, suddenly realizing the sheer, monstrous physical threat the giant posed in the enclosed space. The lead Pinkerton swung his heavy shotgun toward Silas's broad chest, his finger tightening on the rusted trigger. He never got the chance to fire. Silas lunged forward with explosive, terrifying speed, the thick, corded muscles in his massive arms and broad shoulders bulging violently beneath his canvas duster. He swung the massive, 20-pound sledgehammer in a devastating, horizontal arc. In the tight, claustrophobic confines of the stone cabin, the colossal iron weapon was an instrument of pure, unadulterated devastation. The heavy, forged steel head of the sledgehammer connected directly with the wooden stock of the Pinkerton's shotgun and the ribs beneath it. The sound was sickening, a deafening, heavy crack of shattering walnut wood and completely pulverized bone. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic force of the 20-pound hammer physically lifted the mercenary completely off his boots, launching his broken body violently sideways into the heavy timber dining table, entirely neutralizing him in a single, earth-shaking strike. The second thug panicked, frantically racking the lever of his Winchester. He managed to squeeze off a single, deafening shot. The heavy lead bullet grazed the thick canvas of Silas's shoulder, tearing the fabric, but the giant did not even flinch. Silas reversed his grip on the hickory handle, using the momentum of his first swing to carry the massive sledgehammer in a brutal, upward, diagonal uppercut. The solid block of forged steel crashed violently beneath the second thug's jaw. The man's eyes rolled back instantly, his body crumpling to the cold floorboards like a discarded ragdoll. But the sheer, deafening, chaotic violence of the sledgehammer swinging through the room provided a fatal, cowardly distraction. Griggs had completely bypassed the brutal melee. The sadistic foreman skirted along the stone wall, his greedy hands reaching out as he lunged directly toward Nora. He violently grabbed a thick handful of her dark hair, yanking her head backward with a cruel, vicious jerk. Nora cried out, her hands flying up to protect her pregnant belly as the sudden, agonizing pain flared in her scalp. "You're coming with me, you barren wretch!" Griggs screamed over the ringing echoes of the gunshot, entirely blinded by his own toxic arrogance. He began to forcefully drag her backward, his heavy boots slipping on the slick floor, pulling her directly toward the shattered doorway and the treacherous, icy edge of the cliff leading down to the roaring waterfall. He expected her to freeze. He expected the fragile, humiliated, grieving widow from the freezing mud of the wash house to collapse onto her knees, weeping, begging for her miserable life, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating shame he had relentlessly driven into her soul. Nora did not weep. She did not attempt to protect her own face. The suffocating, lifelong horror of being treated as a shamed, worthless piece of property vanished entirely. It was completely, irrevocably incinerated by a blinding, white-hot inferno of absolute, protective, maternal fury. She was not a company asset. She was a mother defending the life growing inside her against a monster. Nora did not pull away. She leaned violently backward against Griggs's grip, plunging her bare right hand directly into the roaring flames of the massive stone hearth. Resting in the burning, white-hot coals was a heavy, solid iron fire poker. Nora's raw, blistered fingers closed tightly around the iron handle. She ripped the poker from the flames. The heavy, jagged iron tip was glowing a brilliant, blinding, cherry red, radiating a wave of blistering, searing heat. "I belong to no one," Nora roared, a primal, feral, deafening battle cry that shook the very rafters of the stone cabin. She twisted her entire body with explosive, devastating force, utilizing every single ounce of her heavy, pregnant momentum. She drove the glowing, white-hot iron tip of the fire poker directly upward, thrusting it forcefully across the side of Foreman Griggs's face and jaw. The horrific, sickening sizzle of searing iron instantly burning into human flesh echoed loudly over the roar of the waterfall. The thick, acrid smell of burnt hair and scorching skin flooded the freezing air. Griggs unleashed a high, piercing, mind-shattering, inhuman shriek of absolute, paralyzing agony. His grip on her hair instantly vanished as his hands flew frantically to his blistering, burning face. Blinded, shrieking, and completely consumed by the searing, agonizing pain of the brand, Griggs stumbled wildly backward. His leather boots hit the slick, black ice coating the stone threshold of the shattered doorway. With a final, terrified, high-pitched wail, the sadistic foreman lost his footing entirely. He careened backward out of the cabin, his flailing arms grasping uselessly at the freezing mist as his momentum carried him directly over the sheer, jagged edge of the granite cliff. His screams faded rapidly into the echoing abyss, culminating in a violent, heavy silence as he was completely swallowed by the deafening, churning white water of the freezing alpine waterfall hundreds of feet below. Nora dropped the glowing fire poker. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, resounding clang. Her chest was heaving with deep, ragged gasps, her arms trembling violently from the massive adrenaline spike, her pale face flushed a dark, vibrant crimson with absolute exertion. She stood tall in the center of the freezing, drafty cabin, the cold air biting at her clothes, entirely unashamed, completely unapologetic. She had defended her child, obliterating the tyrant who had chained her to the mud. The ringing, metallic echoes of the violence slowly faded into the damp, heavy timber of the ceiling, swallowed completely by the relentless, deafening roar of the alpine waterfall just beyond the shattered doorway. The thick, acrid stench of sulfur, burnt hair, and raw, hot copper hung heavily in the freezing draft sweeping through the stone cabin. Nora stood in the center of the devastation, the deep, ragged heave of her breathing the only movement in the room. The glowing iron fire poker lay cooling on the stone floor at her feet, the cherry-red heat slowly fading into a dull, blackened gray. Silas Thorne let the massive, blood-slicked handle of the 20-pound sledgehammer slip from his massive, calloused grip. The heavy forged steel hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. He stood over the broken, unconscious bodies of the Pinkerton mercenaries, his chest heaving, his pale, scarred face entirely unreadable. His dark, haunted eyes slowly moved from the shattered doorway to the woman standing by the hearth. He expected to see horror in her eyes. He expected to see the same terrified, absolute revulsion that the miners of Iron Ridge had looked at him with. He expected her to shrink away from the feral, blood-soaked beast who had just turned his sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. Instead, Nora met his gaze with a profound, unshakable calm. Her dark eyes were completely clear, burning with a fierce, maternal iron that rivaled the heat of the forge. She had not shattered, she had simply been forged into something harder. Silas swallowed hard, the thick muscles of his throat working against a sudden, suffocating tightness. He turned away, unable to bear the sheer, blinding light of her resilience. Without uttering a single word, the giant mountain man bent down, his massive hands grabbing the heavy wool collars of the mercenaries. With effortless, brutal strength, he dragged their unconscious, dead weight out through the splintered doorframe, hauling them into the freezing sleet and depositing them far past the tree line, leaving them for the mountain to claim. When he returned, the freezing alpine wind was still howling through the broken door. Silas retrieved heavy timber planks and thick iron nails from the forge, wordlessly sealing the breach against the plunging temperatures. He worked with a frantic, punishing rhythm, his massive hammer striking the nail heads with deafening force, punishing himself for allowing the violence to breach his walls. Once the cabin was secured and the freezing draft halted, Silas walked to the slack tub in the corner of the room. He plunged his massive, soot-stained, blood-crusted hands into the freezing water, scrubbing violently at his skin with a coarse brush until his knuckles were raw and bleeding. Nora watched him from the heavy wooden chair. She saw the tremor in his massive, corded forearms. She saw the crushing, suffocating weight of his past settling over his broad shoulders like a physical shroud of lead. The bullet graze on his shoulder was sluggishly leaking dark crimson down the torn sleeve of his canvas duster, but he completely ignored the pain. Silas dried his hands on a rough linen towel, keeping his broad back turned to her. He walked to the deepest, darkest corner of the stone cabin. He dropped to one knee and wedged his thick fingers beneath a heavy, loose flagstone, hauling the heavy granite block aside. He reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a heavy, tightly bound leather sack. He carried the heavy burden back to the center of the room and dropped it onto the thick timber dining table. The rawhide drawstrings came loose, and the heavy sack spilled open. A staggering, blinding fortune of raw, unrefined gold nuggets, some as large as robin's eggs, pulled from the deepest, most treacherous alpine veins over a decade of brutal, solitary labor, clattered heavily against the wood. "The trail will be clear by morning," Silas rasped, his voice entirely hollow, stripped of the tectonic, rumbling warmth that had anchored her the night before. The words tore from his throat like crushed glass. He refused to look at her pregnant belly, staring rigidly at the gold. "I will escort you down the back pass. It connects directly to the Central Pacific railhead, bypassing the mining camps entirely. You will take this." Nora's heart seized, a cold, jagged spike of dread piercing her chest. "Silas, what are you saying?" "I am saying the threat is gone, but the danger remains," the giant growled, gripping the edge of the heavy timber table until his thick knuckles turned bone white. "With this wealth, you can buy a first-class ticket to San Francisco. You can secure a private suite in the finest, cleanest hospital on the coast. You will have your child in absolute safety, surrounded by doctors, far away from the filth, the freezing rain, and the blood." He finally forced himself to look up, his dark, haunted eyes completely shattered, filled with a self-loathing so immense it threatened to swallow the cabin entirely. "Look at the blood on my boots, Nora. Look at the slaughter I brought to your feet. I am a scarred, feral beast who lives in the dirt and speaks through butchery. I told you my hands are cursed to destroy everything they touch. I cannot protect you from the brutality of the world when my entire existence is built upon it. Go to the city. Find a gentle man who wears silk and builds with paper. Your child deserves to be born in the light, not in a monster's cave." He turned his broad back to her, his massive shoulders trembling violently as he fought a losing battle against the agonizing, suffocating grief of his own sacrifice. He truly, deeply believed he was entirely unfit to breathe the same air as the magnificent, life-giving woman who had restored his forge and anchored his soul. Nora stared at the heavy pile of raw gold. It was the ultimate key to absolute societal power. It was the financial means to completely erase her past, to escape the harsh, freezing reality of the high mountains, and to finally be deemed acceptable by a civilized world that had literally chained her like a dog. Nora pushed herself up from the heavy wooden chair. She walked slowly toward the heavy timber table. Silas squeezed his eyes tightly shut, listening to her scuffed boots moving across the stone. He waited for the rustle of the leather sack, bracing his scarred soul for the excruciating, final sound of her packing the wealth, preparing to leave him to rot in the silent ice forever. Nora did not touch the leather sack. She reached out with her raw, blistered hands, placed her palms flat against the heavy timber table, and with a sudden, violent, full-body heave, she violently swept the massive fortune of gold directly off the edge. The heavy nuggets hit the stone floor with a deafening, resounding crash, scattering uselessly into the dark, dusty corners of the cabin, entirely ignored and permanently rejected. Silas spun around at the sound of the impact. His jaw dropped, his dark eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. "What have you done? That was your entire future. That was absolute safety for your baby." Nora turned to face him, the warm, flickering firelight illuminating her resilient silhouette and the pronounced, beautiful swell of her pregnancy. She did not look like a frightened, discarded widow. She looked like the absolute, unquestionable sovereign of the High Sierras. "Safety?" Nora demanded, her voice ringing out with a fierce, crystalline authority that commanded the very mountain to bow. She closed the distance between them with steady, majestic strides. Safe in a civilized world? The same civilized world that bolted an iron logging chain to my ankle and claimed my unborn child as company property. The world that measures my human soul by its utility to their miserable ledger. She marched right up to his towering frame, refusing to let him look away, her dark eyes blazing with an overwhelming, consuming inferno of absolute devotion. "I was told my entire life that I was nothing more than a vessel, a piece of property to be traded," Nora stated, her voice trembling with raw, tectonic emotion. She reached out, her raw, blistered hands gripping the heavy canvas lapels of his duster, pulling the giant forcefully downward until his heavily bearded face was inches from hers. "But you looked at my chains and you snapped them with your bare hands. You brought me to the high peaks and you gave me absolute sanctuary when the world threw me away." She pressed her palms gently against his soot-stained cheeks, her thumbs tracing the deep, jagged scars of his past. "My child does not need a cowardly doctor in a sterile city," Nora whispered fiercely, hot tears streaming down her flushed face. "My child needs a father with hands strong enough to shatter chains and a heart brave enough to swing a hammer to defend us. Your hands do not destroy, Silas Thorne. They protect. My roots are permanently planted in this stone. I am not going to San Francisco. I am never, ever leaving this mountain. You are our home." The impenetrable, stoic iron walls of the mountain man instantly, completely disintegrated into dust. A raw, guttural, jagged sob tore itself from the very depths of his massive chest. He collapsed heavily to his knees on the hard stone floor, completely ignoring the bleeding graze on his shoulder. His enormous arms wrapped desperately around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his weeping, scarred face directly into the soft, warm swell of her pregnant belly, clinging to her resilient frame as if she were the only absolute truth in a dissolving universe. "My light," Silas wept silently, the hot tears soaking into the fabric of her faded wool dress, his broad shoulders shaking with the profound, agonizing relief of a man finally, truly brought out of the dark. "My absolute, perfect life. My wife. I am right here," Nora whispered, her calloused fingers weaving gently through his thick, dark hair, cradling his heavy head against her body with fierce, unyielding tenderness. "The storm is over, my love. We will build the fire again." He held her there in the shattered, freezing ruins of the cabin, the profound, heavy silence of the alpine peaks settling warmly over them. The staggering fortune of gold lay completely forgotten in the dirt, but as the scarred mountain man knelt before the magnificent, deeply nurturing woman who had chosen his brutal reality over a gilded cage, he knew he possessed a wealth that could never be mined, chained, or stolen. 5 years later, the dark, claustrophobic stone cabin near the roaring alpine waterfall was a breathtaking, impossible oasis of life on the edge of the high timberline. The fortress had been magnificently expanded outward into a sprawling, sun-drenched, heavy timber frame homestead. A massive, perfectly functioning stone hearth radiated a constant, deep warmth through the wide rooms. The metallic smell of gunpowder and isolation had been permanently eradicated, replaced by the warm, sweet, intoxicating aroma of roasting venison, blooming alpine columbine, and the rich, complex depth of a masterfully managed, roaring forge. Nora was no longer the chained, humiliated outcast of the territory. She was its most revered, legendary matriarch, sought out by passing riders and isolated trappers alike for her immense wisdom and the unbreakable, flawless tools forged by her husband. Sitting in a heavy rocking chair carved from solid pine on the expansive, sunlit porch was Nora. She wore a beautifully tailored, vibrant blue dress of soft, breathable wool. She was entirely radiant, her dark eyes sparkling with profound, overflowing joy. The fragile, exhausted, terrified widow weeping in the black mud was a distant, unrecognizable memory. She moved with total, unshakable confidence, owning her power and her sanctuary with the absolute, undeniable grace of a queen. She looked out toward the open-air forge, the rhythmic, heavy, musical clang-clang-clang of a hammer striking an anvil echoing beautifully over the thunderous roar of the waterfall. Standing in the brilliant, golden afternoon sunlight was Silas. He wore a clean flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his incredibly thick, heavily muscled, heavily scarred forearms. The cold, dead, feral terror in his dark eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep, oceanic peace. Standing beside him on a sturdy wooden stool, gripping a small, perfectly weighted iron hammer with both hands, was a robust, dark-haired 4-year-old boy. The child was striking a small piece of heated iron on the massive anvil, giggling with wild, untamed joy as his father guided his movements. Silas's massive, calloused hand rested protectively over the boy's small hands, ensuring every strike was safe, true, and perfectly angled. The terrifying giant who once believed his massive hands only destroyed was now patiently, lovingly, and gently teaching the next generation exactly how to build. Silas paused, wiping his soot-stained brow with the back of his massive wrist, and looked back toward the porch. He smiled, a deep, rich expression that completely transformed his heavily scarred face. He didn't just look at his wife, he worshipped her. He raised his massive hand in a silent, devoted greeting. His dark eyes met hers, filled with an adoration that was legendary across the entire High Sierra range. The cruel, greedy society festering in the miserable mining camps far below could keep their rigid ledgers, their heavy iron chains, and their false promises of civilization. Here, insulated against the howling alpine winds, the scarred Leviathan and the resilient mother had proven with absolute, undeniable certainty that the strongest iron is not forged in the cold fires of industry, but in the unyielding, unbreakable heat of a chosen, fiercely protected love.